Shim's going to comfort us.
You've got permission to record, Lee. Yeah, there we go. Got it.
Okay, Rob, thank you very much. I'm recording. Thank you, Rob.
Okay. I think we're there.
You know that ons Shebe has got Verdrus because Verdrus are bitter. Got Verdrus.
What's the Fadrus?
She was beaten by Verdruskova. So how's it, man? How's the family? Thank you. Thank you.
There's anything surpluses.
Oh, look who's here. Shalom.
Is perfect. Perfect.
Okay, I'll get there for sure because
Thank you so much, Jesse. You're such a gentleman. Thanks.
I mean, just
We can say Shabbos. If we could get to Shabbos, I'd be very happy. I'd be very happy if we could get to Shabbos.
Shame, you heard about Rebecca's son.
Yeah, no, it's
Was the biggest since 1983 in South Africa. There were over 1,000 people.
I think even more.
I'm
Saki. Yeah, hectic story. Young fellow had a brain aneurysm. Sorry? Was it a tumor? Was it aneurysm? Aneurysm.
Obviously, it went to the brain.
Yeah.
And when the brain starts swelling,
So trying to get us the
and I heard an ambulance. Then I saw 4 ambulances on the and then for about probably I don't know how long, but about 50 or 60 ambulances.
yeah, they made a procession to honor him.
It.
There are clips.
Unbelievable.
Aubrey, if you want it on record, there are clips of that scene.
Yeah,
There are clips.
You once.
the whole
You,
because I caught right from the beginning. And I actually couldn't believe
Where did he stay? He stayed in Orange Road.
the morgue is at the old age home.
Shame.
So that's where yeah, it must be
Too terrible.
But it wasn't only Attila, it was 911, many of the ambulance services, many of the responders.
Yeah.
He was
oh, he was a lovely human being. He was an exceptionally wonderful human being.
Boats there.
Okay, let's just.
can't not drink them up.
Okay.
Nice.
I think we've got it. Yeah.
You got some boats there, man.
Milk.
Climb
When you.
Thank you. Climb around the.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
They finally bring you the whiskey.
There's still back.
Yeah, we got a bar.
Are you gonna have small? I'm gonna have very small because I'm on a little bit of a diet, but I'll have a little.
More plates, please. More plates.
Nice.
Just plain.
We're
You know what? I'm gonna have it the way it is. Maybe for scratchy throats, I'm just gonna have it the way it is, as is. As is tonight.
Here we go. Does anyone want ginger? More in this bar.
Does anybody need a place?
Angela, swap your plate. So you want to and then Effie, you want a piece?
I need a small one. I want to waste. So we can cut it a little bit. How do I cut it? Just a tiny little one that doesn't. That's. I want to send the rest. to a good customer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam bo'elem milei mezainos.
Anyone else for ginger cake?
No.
You want a piece? Have another piece. Who else would like anyone for ginger? Do you want anyone? Another piece.
Please, thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you so very much.
Yossi, the ginger cake is delicious. Lekker.
Just something before we start. People continue to say to him,
Yeah.
every
I'm Sholem. Yeah. For the Nishma they're saying now. It's like saying Mishnayos. You're saying it for the soul and for the family to have strength. For Hashem to give strength to the family and for the neshama and for the soul. It's a different kind of tillim, but it's prayer. You can daven for the departed. It's a different kind of thing, but you can still daven. You can say tillim for the departed also. Yeah. Although what's more common is mishnayos actually when it comes to the departed. People normally learn favors, Abbas or any other kind of mishnayos. Yeah. Tehillim is always good.
Which are the best psalms to say?
All of yeah. Look at there's programs to say there's special ones for each day.
21.
Then you can finish Tehillim in months. That's the best is to say the day
The
Tehillim.
Bacher says it everything on Shabbos. All the
That's the Shabbos before
Shabbos before Rosh
before Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos Mevorachim. But on a daily basis, one can say the Tehillim as it's divided for the 30 days of the month.
But can you do it instead?
Sorry? Yeah.
Can you do that instead? Shabbos before.
No, it's both. It's not instead.
It's a lot.
One is, yeah.
It's a lot, eh? Sure.
For sure. 2 hours normally. 2 hours and 20 minutes, 2:15. Some people are quicker. Should we get going? Gentlemen? I nearly said ladies and gentlemen. Your grandfather. Yeah. Eliyahu ben Yitzchak. Please have in mind Ephraim's grandfather, Eliyahu ben Yitzchak. And we can have in mind Chaim Sholem Saki, Chaim Shon ben Michal Ze'ev, Nishmat, Gidon ben Malka.
Beryl's wife, what's her name again? Do you remember her name?
That's now for a Shlema.
She's now in the private order now. So
I know who you mean. Chaye El Sharon.
yeah,
That Farrell Shear's wife. Yeah. I for a second, it took me an extra second to click who you're talking about.
yeah,
Like I said to you, I did her bat mitzvah.
yeah, that's right.
I know very well.
Chaye
Chaye El Sharon. Yeah.
And Rabbi Goldberg, Rabbi.
Oh wow. David ben Shraga. So Brian's brother, your side tonight, 7th. What's tonight? The 7th of Av.
And Rabbi Goldberg.
His mother, 2 brothers, and a Bobber. There's 3 but in the 9 days.
Sure. Wow. Wow. It's a whole bunch of yortzats in that small time span.
You want me to cut this as well?
Yeah.
The blood
Wow.
clot.
Gentlemen, let's learn a little bit. Milton came all the way from Parkwood to learn. As we did come from Hurlingham, Hyde Park, whatever you want to call it. Actually not, because we could technically. We sort of make a diagonal and go through Melrose. Wonder if you want to get
Goldberg as well, eh? You know what his Hebrew name?
No, you're gonna have to help us with that.
The topic is.
Was Mark Short, that's one.
Yeah, that's right. That's another one. We can think about Mike Schwartz. He passed away. The Levaya was today. That was Zalman Meir ben Reuven. Yeah, I know. I was also surprised that there's no Michael there. Yeah. The Ariya Kadosh should be a source for all of us.
Another Zalman Yom.
Sergio was your test Tammuz. No, Sergio was your test Tammuz. I'm pretty sure. 19th of Tammuz, yeah. 2018. That one I remember. I got such a fright. No, come sit down.
Where about gold?
I did. I fell asleep at the other Shiur.
That's what I'm busy looking right now. So this is
Thank you. Thank you very much.
He's suddenly Simcha's happening at the Kollel. Jeez, there's so many.
Gemora Papa. I think that's when we will Papa interpret. I think it's over there. About whose one is this? Mark's.
That's Michael set up.
Okay.
Where about gold?
Okay. Are we ready, guys? 1, 2, 3, and off we go. Moshe Ariel ben Chava. So the Gemora continues its discussion. Lamates. No, it's actually Mem Amud Aleph. Mem Amud Aleph. I think it's about halfway down. You want to give me the Gemara? I'll find it for you. Yes, I can find it in Jeff's. That's Mem Amud Aleph. Here we go. Tirgamor of Papa. It's going to be over there. So you need the one that goes on with this one.
You will supply to everyone.
Tirgamor of Papa is there.
Okay.
And in this one, it's there. 48.2. If you're using an art scroll, 48.2 on the right hand side. If you're using a classic text, Mem Amud Bays, no, sorry, Amud Aleph, Daf Mem Amud Aleph. We're in the middle of a concept there, and the Gemora continues its discussion of how do you know about fish that you purchase from a Gentile, and especially if the fish is cut into chunks or minced into paste. And if you remember, there were certain general rules we already spoke about. I'm not going all the way back to the beginning so that we move a little bit, but I'm going to reread about 3 or 4 lines from where it says Tirgamor of Papa, and
anyone
just reminding everybody that there were different things said. How do you recognize whether the fish that is minced or so in those days there wasn't necessarily a hechsher, you're correct, Ephraim, but they also have to know how to recognize. Yeah. And then there was a piece that we had just a few lines above, which said that if you have a barrel of fish floating in some kind of brine, and somebody can identify even one chunk and say that that definitely comes from a kosher species, maybe he sees the skin or the bones. The Gemora had said that the shedra and the rosh, the head and the spine, are particularly, because when a person sees the head or the spine of the fish, it gives them a good idea what kind of fish it is, what kind of species it is. And at one point, there was a passage which even said that if one chunk only, one piece only can be identified, then the rest of it is considered to be okay. In other words, even though there's a whole bunch of different pieces floating in the same, how'd you call it, in the same bowl, in the same barrel, but because you can identify one piece, in certain circumstances, you're allowed to assume that all the other pieces that are floating there come from the same kind of fish as the piece that you can identify, and therefore all of it's okay. And then the Gemora wanted to bring the opinion, and that's where we were up to. Tiri Gemora, Rav Papa interpreted that brisa and explained, only when the pieces correspond to each other. They're a bit like a puzzle. In other words, there was a question raised because somewhere else it said, no, you have to identify each piece. You can't go and certify the whole barrel kosher, but you can identify only one piece. And by the way, not to get too worried, this is the structure of Gemora. It moves this way and that way, but like ping pong or tennis. One moment it's this side of the paddle. It's a bit like this paddle. It's a bit like, so one moment it's on this side of the net, the next it's on that side of the net. So Gemora is very much the same, that at one point we were saying that you identify each and every piece, and you can't identify only one piece. And then another passage said if you can identify one piece, then you're allowed to assume that all the other pieces are the same. So Rav Papa explained, if the pieces look like a puzzle, if they look like they come from the same fish, from the same puzzle, that's why we said if you identify one, it's good for all of them. But if it's not a puzzle, if it doesn't look like they match up, then maybe you would need to identify all of them. One wouldn't be enough. And then the Gemara asked the question, if so, why do I need to say this at all? In other words, sometimes the Gemara asks a question, why are you teaching me the obvious? If it's so clear that it's one fish that's broken up into pieces, then it's very clear that identifying one piece is good. Why do I need to know this? So the Gemara says, Mao de Taima, because I might have said, maybe I would have thought it's by chance. You know, sometimes things look like they fit. Maybe I would have thought that even if they look like they all fit together, but you still might have to say it's not necessarily the same. And you can't rely on all of them being certified kosher because of one. Komash Malon, we learn that you can. So that basically was the last piece of the one we did last week, which was reconciling the two views, why it is that sometimes we're demanding that you have to be able to recognize each and every piece and identify it as kosher. And sometimes we allow you to identify one piece and then extrapolate that if that one piece is okay, so is the rest of the barrel. It depends how they fit. That was most of the discussion last week. This week's discussion is very similar, continues the story. And maybe just a few words of introduction before we read it inside. The Gemora tells us a story. We know that the pattern, the style of Gemora is to a certain degree argumentative, it's debate, but then it's also very anecdotal, meaning the Gemora will quote stories, which incidents that happened, where different people had a real situation put in front of them. So the Gemara tells us about a ship, a fish ship that was carrying fish that landed in a certain place. And it tells us that there were two rabbis there that had a difference of opinion about the fish that the ship was carrying. It must have been quite important to the people there. I guess a full shipload of fish is a good deal. Maybe it was the 9 days that people needed their fish badly. It seems they wanted to eat the fish that was on the ship. The ship arrived. The boat arrived. And the Gemara tells a story that there were two sages. One sage said that he went onto the ship and he saw scales and he was happy. The scales may have not been on the fish. It sounds like the scales were floating around in the ship. But it seemed that all the fish on the ship were one species. You know, like when you catch sardines in a sardine run, you're generally getting one type across the boat. Across the board, it's one species. And if you recall, in one of our previous Gemaras, we had learned a special thing about fish, which doesn't apply to other animals, that snapir v'kaskeses b'mayim, The Torah had said, if it has fins and scales in the water, why did the Torah say in the water? The rabbis learned because it doesn't have to have them after the water, it only has to have them in the water. So if you pull them out the water and they fall off, it's okay, as long as you know that they were there. So if the fish is lying in the bowl and his scales are next to him, it's also okay. In fact, going even further, I think it says somewhere that if you have a marine species that has scales that don't come off easily, that's a problem. In other words, the kind of scales we're looking for are in fact scales that you can descale your fish quite easily. So what happens is the ship arrives and Rav Huna Bar Chinana goes on the ship. They called him onto the ship. He was the, how would you call it, the Rav that they called onto the ship. The Mashgiach, the inspector, and he saw scales on the ship and he said, you know what? These scales must be from these fish. And he permitted, he said, this whole load is okay. And Rava went on to the same ship and he said, no. He said, you know what, where this ship is coming from is a place where most of the fish have scales. So there could be scales from previous stock. Could be they were carting kosher fish somewhere and they never cleaned the ship. They never hosed it down. How can you decide that these scales for sure belong to these fish? And they had an argument that each one had a Beth Din, and they sent out a different ruling. So let's read it inside. How Arba the Tzachanta, the Gemora tells a story. There was a ship filled with a small species of fish, a whole big load of sardine-like mini fish called Tzachanta. The Asel Sichra. They came to a city called Sichra. Sichra was a city on apparently on the west side of the Tigris or Tigris River. Sounds like we're talking somewhere in Iraq, in modern day terms, but there were a lot of Jewish communities there in those days. The fact Rav Huna Bar Chinana went out onto the ship. V'chazer by Kalfa, he saw scales. V'sharya, and he permitted this shipload of fish. He said, all's good. Amalei Rava said to him, Rava, what's the word, debated him. Umi'ika the sharaka haigavna. How are you able to permit such a situation? But Asra the shchicha kalfa, in a place, in other words, the ship comes from a place where plenty fish have scales. Navak shipura the Rava v'asa shipura the Rav Huna Bar Chinana v'shara. What happened was the shofar, meaning the trumpet sound, came out from the office or the Beth Din of Rava saying prohibited, and from the Beth Din of Rav Huna Bar Chinana saying permitted. In other words, they remained in their debate, in their boxing match over this shipload. So if you wanted to trust Rav Huna Bar Chinana, you could eat the fish. If you wanted to trust Rava, you couldn't eat the fish. Basically, they remained staunch, that each remained steadfast to his view. And it seems that in those days, because there wasn't yet WhatsApp, Facebook, some guy used to blow a shofar, used to blow a trumpet, and he'd give the message. The message from the rabbi over here is that that ship at the port has been inspected, and he's of the view that those fish cannot be certified kosher. That's what came out of Rava's court. And what came out of the court of Rav Huna Bar Chinana was the opposite. I went on the ship and I saw scales, and I'm happy. From this, the Gemora goes into a debate about the debate. This happens often. What's the debate about the debate? We've come across this before. The debate about the debate is, where do we go into the participants? Let's mute everybody. Yeah. The debate about the debate is like this, that, oops, that's got to go off. Yeah, is the following. Do you remember we had this already in one of the previous Gemara? Sometimes you get concepts that come back again in a different context, where the Gemara told us a few lines, maybe a half a page back, I think it came up in last week's session, that there's a difference between the flesh of the fish and a brine that's created from the fish soaking or pickling, if you remember. Yeah. And the rabbis had pointed out that the brine is a lower degree, a lower tier prohibition than the fish itself. Somehow or another, it would seem that although the Torah prohibited non-kosher fish, brine that's created from non-kosher fish might also be prohibited, but that's a precautionary measure by the rabbis. That wasn't a Torah prohibition. And therefore, because it's like a gravy, it's like a water or a sauce that's made from it. So there's a different tier, different level of the degree of prohibition. You're eating fish that's not kosher, or if you're eating brine, which was created from fish that's possibly not kosher. Now, that's called tzir or tziron. We spoke about that. It came up in other contexts. And the Gemora wants to say now that maybe Rav Huna bar Chinona was not permitting that whole shipload of fish. He was saying that if you want to rely on the brine, then it's good enough that I saw scales. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Medifta. Rabbi Yirmiyah Medifta said, Amali Rav Papi came to me and said, Kishara Rav Huna bar Chinona, when Rav Huna bar Chinona permitted that shipload of fish. But Siron, he was talking about the brine. Aval begufan lai, he didn't permit the actual flesh of the fish themselves. There he wasn't sure enough to say they're okay. Amar Rav Ashi said, no, Ladidi Amali Rav Papa, according to me, Rav Papa explained, Kishara Rav Huna bar Chinona afilu begufan. When Rav Huna bar Chinona said, I saw scales and I'm happy that that fish is kosher, he did mean even the flesh of the fish. So you see, you have a difference of opinion as to what he meant when he said, I saw scales and that fish is kosher. One view is he only meant the brine. Another view is meant, in fact, the fish itself. You can go spread it on your sandwich. And Rav Ashi continued to explain what he himself would do. In other words, sometimes you get a view, and that view is one thing, and a person might say, you know, once upon a time, you could have a concept where you'd ask a person a shaila, Rova, somebody a question, and he would tell you, according to halacha, academic law, I can't tell you no, because if you look at the different arguments for and against, it's okay. And a person would say, but Rabbi, would you yourself eat it? So honestly, no. You're getting two different answers. One answer is intellectual, that, you know, it's a little bit like instinct. I think you get the same thing sometimes. Everybody should be gesund. You can have it with medical people, you can have it whatever, that they might have an intellectual calculation and they might have an instinctive calculation. And they'll tell you straight that my instinct, you know, this is what maybe tests show, this is what logic shows, but I have an instinctive feeling, I've got to be honest with you, that's different to what's coming up on the screen or whatever. So it can happen that the rabbi says to him, you know what? And at the end of the day, I can't find a reason. I can't find a basis to go and prohibit this whole load of fish. You're asking me, will I have it for supper? No. I had a guy in my shul some years ago who used to always end off his questions like that, like, what would you do? By the way, I heard it's a very good question to ask. What would you do if it was you or your family?
I said myself,
Sorry, I did. Yeah.
No, when I went to the ophthalmologist,
Yeah.
and he says, you need to have a cataract. So I said, if I was your father, what would you say? He said, I'd say wait tomorrow.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So he actually changed the answer.
Well, he said you can have it, but I said
I'd say wait.
well,
That's interesting.
Yeah. So he said I'd wait.
Fascinating. He said then I'd wait. Wow. Wow. So in other words,
just concerned about your medical.
what? So the Anal sort of Ashi said, you know, it's very interesting. There's a beautiful story about, I don't know if I'm sure I mentioned it once before, but maybe for the benefit of anybody that wasn't here at that shiur, that, you know, once upon a time, people had shaylas, they had questions, they were kashering, you know, it wasn't today like you go to Moshe's and you buy everything packaged. People took a shechted chicken home and they kashered it in their own house or whatever it was. And there was a lady that had a question on a chicken, and she took the chicken to the Rav. She was cooking because it looked like there was an injury, and certain injuries, if you see them afterwards, render it invalid or treif, even if it was slaughtered correctly and whatever. So she goes, and sometimes, you know, cooking supper is important. They were able to disturb the shiur or whatever, And so the rabbi is sitting there with the students, and he has to have a quick look at the chicken and tell her whether it's okay or not. Yeah. So she goes there, the rabbi's sitting with the students, and she's got the chicken, and she starts to approach him with her question, like, is this injury, is this problem a problem or not? So the rabbi was thinking aloud, because he looked at the problem on the chicken, and in his mind came up two opinions, like we had over here. In his mind came up one opinion which would permit it, and another opinion which would prohibit it. So he started out by saying the first opinion, like when you're thinking aloud. He said, like the Rambam, according to Maimonides, this would be okay. And he was about to say, but according to somebody else, it's not okay, and then he would do the way up. But the first thing he said, according to Maimonides, it would be okay. The next thing she says, okay, I'm fine, I'm going home. He said, I'm not finished answering you. She said, no, did you just say that Maimonides is happy with his chicken? Then I'm pretty good too. Have a good day. He said, what are you talking about? He says, if the Rambam could eat that chicken, then so can I. So Rav Ashi said, I myself would not prohibit the fish. Why? Because Rav Papa told me this. Rav Papa told me that the permissibility was for the fish itself, not just for the brine. So I cannot pronounce a prohibition. I also can't permit it. Because Rav Yehuda in the name of Ula told me that the argument was about dipping one's bread or one's crackers in the brine of that kind of fish. But with regard to consuming the flesh of the fish, Divrei Hakel, everybody agrees that you have to be able to see and identify the Rosh and the Shedra, the head and the spine of each and every fish. So basically, Rav Ashi is saying that I've got a dilemma. I have one important rabbi who told me that when he prohibited that shipload of fish, I wonder who's going to take responsibility for the shipload of fish if the insurance has to pay for the whole load. Rav Ashi is saying it's a loss. Rav Ashi is saying, I've got a problem. I've got one rabbi who told me that when Rav Huna permitted it, he only permitted the brine. So I can't permit the flesh. And I've got another rabbi who told me clearly that when Rav Huna permitted it, he did permit the flesh. So therefore, I myself, I don't have grounds against either. I can't prohibit it. I can't permit it. I myself don't eat it. You want to be my guest. The Gemora continues by telling us a story. Yosef Rav Chinana bar Ida kama de Rav Ada bar Abba. Rav Chinana bar Ida was sitting in the presence of Rav Ada bar Abba. But Yosef ka'omar, he sat there and he said the following: Oived kechavim, if a non-Jew came along, he brought again a shipload filled with barrels. There were barrels of fish chunks pickling in brine, and they were brought by a non-Jewish fellow. And now we don't know what kind of fish is soaking in the brine, what kind of brine it is. Can we trust this guy? But what we did find was a kosher fish was floating in one of them. In one of his barrels, in one of his containers, somebody sees a kilbis floating. Kilbit was identified by the Gemora as a kosher fish. And we had said earlier on that if you find a kosher fish floating in the barrel of brine that the non-Jew brings, we had said earlier on that you're allowed to make an assumption. You're allowed to extrapolate that because there's a fish you can identify, that the rest of the brine in that barrel must have been made from the same kind of fish. But here we're saying he's got a whole boatload of them. He wants to sell you a boat. So the Gemara says, Suchos kulan mutaros. If these are open barrels, then the fact that there is a kosher fish floating in one of them covers all of them. And all the barrels can be assumed to contain brine from the same kind of fish. Stumos, if they sealed, He muteris, the one barrel that you saw the kosher fish in is okay. V'kul anasuris and the rest are prohibited. In other words, if they've already been sealed up, maybe that's from somewhere else. You know, if somebody sealed something up, it sounds like they finished, they made it, they sealed it, they might have put a date or a seal. It's not necessarily that what's found in one would have an impact on another. But if all of the barrels are open, it looks like a fresh production. He's been busy. You know, like even nowadays when the fishermen go out to sea, we hear often they do canning and all processes on the boats. I've heard from the guys that do the tuna production that they actually do the canning and everything on the boats these days.
Yeah.
They haul the fish out the water and there's a whole factory on the water. So basically, if he comes in with a big boat and the barrels are still open, our assumption is he's busy. That's his production. And if there's a good kilbit, a kosher fish floating in one barrel, this is what he's been busy with, this kind of fish. He's been making stew with the same kind of fish. He's been making brine. But if some of the barrels are closed, that could be stock from anywhere. That could be somebody else's stock.
How about you open the barrel and you see
No, the others are not permitted by the fish in that, in what he's saying is if you found a kosher fish in one barrel, it doesn't permit the others. You're right, you can open them. If you find a kosher fish in another one, that one's also okay. But you can't make one kosher because of another. One barrel cannot ride on another. Sorry? No, this is not about batel b'shishim. It's about trying to figure out what kind of fish this was made from originally. And because there was a kosher fish floating in the barrel, we're allowed to assume that that's the species that is used.
Yeah, but if it's open barrel, they could drop in different fish.
They could do many things.
Yeah.
But the rabbi's assumption is, you're right, they could do anything. But
you open it, you see one fish, it's beat them.
so you're saying that sealing, that the fact that it's sealed in some cases is even better. But in this particular case, he's saying that when you see a kosher fish in one barrel, if the others are open, you can assume it's all part of the same team. He's busy. He's making it right now. But if the rest, if they are closed, stumois, they closed barrels, he muteres, that particular barrel is allowed, the barrel where you found the kosher fish. But kulanasuros, the rest of them are prohibited, unless you find your own way to amalei. So he asked him, Menalach, how do you know this? Where do you get this halacha from? Rav Ada bar Abba said to Rav Chinana Baridi, Menalacha, how do you know this rule that you've just said? This formula, that if the barrels are open, one fish exempts the whole boat. If they're closed, it only exempts that barrel. So he said, Mitlosa kroi shmieli. I heard this from 3 verses. Verses normally means verses in the scriptures, in Tanakh. Because often in the Gemora, a verse from Torah will be quoted as a proof, as a raya. But in this case, he meant it figuratively. He was talking about 3 big sages that had taught him this lesson. And he calls them verses figuratively. And he mentions who they are. Mitlosa kroi shmieli. From 3 verses, which he means 3 giant scholars, I heard this. And who are they? Me Rav Shmuel va Rabbi Yochanan. I heard from Rav, I heard from Shmuel, I heard from Rabbi Yochanan. From those 3 scholars, those 3 giants, which to me are as good as verses from the Torah. In other words, that's a hectic compliment. It's as good as having a verse in the Torah. I learned from them this rule, that if the barrels are open, you can extrapolate that the entire boat is kosher fish. And if the barrels are closed, it only helps the barrel that you see the kosher fish in and not the rest of the barrels. That pretty much concludes the discussion over the fish and being able to identify the fish. What the Gemora moves on to now, which we'll probably have to finish next week, we can just taste it a bit. Excuse the pun. It's the 9 days, so we're eating a bit of fish over here. What the Gemora moves to now is the secondary products of fish. The caviar, the eggs from the fish, the roe. How do you know if that is kosher, and what are the requirements regarding the stuff that comes from the fish? And that's the discussion that begins over here. Omar Rav Bruna, Omar Rav. We know, we've spoken of it a few times before, in general terms, the usual principle is when you know exactly which animal produced something, you go by where it comes from. In other words, if a kosher bird lays an egg, then you know that it's a kosher egg. And if that happens in front of your eyes, then you don't need any signs on the egg because a kosher bird laid a kosher egg. The other way around, same. If it's a non-kosher bird that lays an egg in front of you, then it's not a kosher egg. The same would apply to just about all things. The product of a kosher animal is kosher. The how would you call it? The the product of a non-kosher animal is not. By the way, I think we mentioned it before. Sorry?
Only the beach.
There's two exceptions. There's two exclusions where you get a product that's kosher and the one who produces it isn't. One is mother's milk. Humans are not kosher for consumption. Even if we were cannibals, we couldn't have a kosher meal.
What do we know?
We're not kosher. You can't eat the flesh of a person. It's treif. And the milk that the person produces is kosher. And the other one is bees. Bees, you can't eat bees, but the honey that they produce is kosher. There's all different discussions about why. The main reason with honey actually is because it's not really a product of the bee. The bees collect the pollen from the blossoms, but they don't actually produce it. But it's, yeah. Or you could say it's a masoret, huh? Tell it to the bees. But generally, if you take out those two exceptions, milk from humans, chalav isha, honey from bees, which is a masoret, the general principle is if it is kosher, then what it produces is kosher. If it isn't kosher, then if a goat is kosher, goat's milk is kosher. If a pig is not kosher, pig's milk is not kosher. When it comes to the eggs of fish and whatever, there might be times that you find the byproduct, but you don't find the original producer. You might find eggs and not know which bird produced it. You might find fish eggs in the ocean, you're harvesting. Certain fish would put their eggs in certain places. Generally, you might find, I don't know, whatever it is, there are expensive delicacies like caviar, which are made from the stuff. Somebody might find it or be able to harvest it. And for whatever reason, it's been separated from the original fish. So the Gemora now goes into a discussion of when and how can you rely on whether or not the byproduct is kosher. So we'll read just a few lines and then we'll do most of it next week. Omar Rav Bruna, Omar Rav. Rav Bruna says in the name of Rav, Kirva dogim ve'ubaron, the innards of fish, like the inside, that's the intestines and the stuff inside, as well as ubaron, as well as their, their eggs, can only be purchased from an expert. You need somebody that knows exactly what's going on. The Gemora will discuss what an expert means, but in general, it would mean somebody who's very good at identifying. It can tell you how and why they know that these are the eggs of that kind of fish. These are the innards of that kind of fish.
Is roe the eggs?
Yeah, roe is fish eggs.
Heavy on.
Then the Gemora launches into a discussion, which maybe we'll handle again most of it next time, that there's a certain place that seems to say that generally fish that make eggs, fish that spawn eggs, are kosher fish. And any fish that doesn't, where the fish gives birth without the eggs being laid properly outside, in other words, even if there are eggs, they're more or less inside the fish, are not kosher. And the Gemara launches into a discussion because that's not a view that everyone agrees with. In other words, there is a view that it's stated somewhere that all egg-laying fish happen to be fins and scale fish, and any fish that don't have fins and scales produce their young differently, distinctly differently. The Gemara discusses what the differences are. The eggs might be internal as opposed to external. They're not planted in the water or on plants or on surfaces. There are those that say that that's the case. So you would be able to differentiate the eggs from where you find them and how you find them. But then there are those that say that it's not so, that it's not conclusive in halacha. law doesn't have such a conclusion that there's no doubt that non-kosher fish don't, I think the word is spawn or put their eggs externally. I think, you know what, we'll stop over there and we'll carry on with the discussion on of fish eggs and insides from next week. Okay.
Only the king.
Yeah.
When you take the king out of water.
Yeah, the scales come. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.